Good morning. Thanks for being with us again today. And I'm glad to host a panel with so experienced colleagues surrounding me, Marilena Koppa, Thanos Dokos, Oana Lungescu, Nikos, Loutas, and Barbora Maronkova, to discuss how NATO is doing at 75. Certainly it's not retiring, this is for sure. We had this discussion at 70, and still there was no retirement. And at least at this panel, but I strongly believe in the room as well, the belief is that NATO is still very relevant. If it was not for NATO, we would already had a war in Europe. We have a war with proxy, unfortunately. Ukraine is giving the battle for us. But NATO is an organization that has adapted enormously during the last 2 decades, and it continues adapting. This is why we have invited a panel of experts and practitioners with a long experience on NATO. I will start with my good colleague, Oana Lungescu, who served for 13 years as NATO spokesperson, and I will start with a question. So, NATO transformed continuously during the last 2 decades and giving a very robust answer to the invasion in Ukraine. NATO was reinforced after the Russian invasion in Ukraine. So, where we stand, what NATO should do more?
Okay. Big questions. First, let me say Kalimera, and it's great to be here in Delphi, and also congratulations to, I think, all of us, but especially to our Greek friends and allies, because you are now in an alliance that has lasted even longer than the Delian League, which I think lasted for about 74 years. NATO has lasted for 75 years and remains the strongest alliance in history. And I'd say NATO has continued to transform throughout the decades, and that is the strength of NATO. But what has not changed is the fact that its focus is on a very simple but solemn promise that an attack against one will be viewed as an attack against all. And for us as individuals, is actually being in NATO is about having the freedom to live the life we want, the freedom and the peace. So it's a very simple, basic need that we all have to live the life we want. And just looking back at my own history, as you can probably see from my name, I was born in Romania, so I was born under communism. I'm not as old as NATO. I was born in 58, but 58 was actually the year when the Soviet troops pulled out of Romania. And for us, growing up, for my family, you know, thinking of NATO and the European Union was about, you know, a dream of being able to live in freedom and in peace the lives that we would want to live. So for throughout the Cold War, NATO was there to defend against the Soviet Union. And when the Cold War ended and the Berlin Wall came down, obviously everything changed for Europe. It changed for me as an individual. And then I was able to cover, working for the BBC, the accession of the countries of the former Warsaw Pact, which had been, you know, most of them under Soviet occupation, some until 1994, like East Germany, freely choose to be part of this alliance of democracies, an alliance of values, and to choose their own path, to live as they wanted to do. Things changed again, of course, with 9/11. For the first time, Article 5, key for the founding Washington Treaty of NATO, was invoked, not in support of European countries, as I think many thought when the article was written, but in support of the United States. And the fight against terrorism remains an important issue for NATO. But of course, as the Minister was saying, and as Ino was saying, with 2014, the focus on collective defense once again came to the center of NATO's mission. And since 2014, we have seen what I would call a decade of transformation for NATO, a decade of very significant strengthening across a whole range of issues. For the first time, we have combat-ready troops in the east of the alliance, from the Baltic to the Black Sea. For instance, we have the battle group in Bulgaria, where Greece is also taking part, but we have battle groups all along the Eastern Front. We have new defense plans, the most detailed, the most robust defense plans since the Cold War, which are being exercised as we speak, with the biggest exercise, again, since the Cold War, Steadfast Defender, an exercise with 90,000 troops. There's stronger defense spending, again, as the Minister was saying, unprecedented, actually, since the Cold War, when all our countries took the peace dividend and started cutting. Of course, Greece was always a leader in defense spending, and in 2014 it was one of the only 3 allies that was spending over 2%. Now it's on 3.5%, and I think you're leading the way in terms of what other allies will need to do. And also engaging more broadly across the world with other like-minded partners. So, for instance, the partnership with the Indo-Pacific 4, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and South Korea, is getting stronger and stronger because, of course, while NATO remains a regional alliance of Europe and North America, the challenges that we face are global, and we also see that autocracies are coming closer together: Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. So it's even more existential for us that we stand together with democracies, and of course that we continue to support Ukraine.
Thank you very much, Oana. Indeed, Thanos, coming to you, there is NATO pre-Ukraine, NATO post-Ukraine, in my view. There is a difference between the two periods that the in regards of the threats the alliance is facing. You took part in a reflection group on the South, because what happened with Ukraine is that the focus again turned towards East, and correctly so. But the challenges in the South have not disappeared. In the South, we have some more complex challenges. I mean, asymmetric threats, terrorism, climate change, even migration. So could you please tell us in this report what the main conclusions are? And secondly, how Greece is facing these challenges?
Well, thank you. You know, it's a pleasure to be in a room with so many friends and also many young people. 2 quick remarks before I try to answer your question. The first is NATO is now a respectable, wise institution at the age of 75. It went through a midlife crisis in its mid-40s, and then lots of people ask the question, now that the Soviet Union is gone and there's no more Warsaw Pact, why do we need NATO? And I very much like 2 metaphors used at the time. One was that you don't throw away your umbrella because it starts raining. And the other is that NATO is like an insurance policy. You keep it just in case. Now it's obvious why NATO should have continued to exist. Second point, yes, Article 5 applies, but someone potentially important said, not if you haven't paid your subscription, i.e. 2%. Hopefully that will not be the case, but it's just noting this. The problem with the South, now, the mission of NATO in the eastern flank is very clear. It's about deterrence, protecting its member states, keeping the peace. The problem with the South, and all of us, all Southern members have been saying for years, do not ignore the South. We need NATO. And then we had that discussion just before we started. And then NATO officials asked, right, so tell us exactly what do you want us to do in the South. And there was no, if not exactly silence, there were no clear answers. Now, what we try to do with a group of experts is, first of all, define the South. And this is not an easy exercise because, the South is everything south of Europe, and that may go a very long way. Secondly, there is also, which complicated both our exercise, but also NATO's and the EU's life, and that will continue, is the concept of the Global South. But then the second question is, and let me tell you very quickly, we define the South as, well, the obvious regions, North Africa, Middle East, Gulf, plus the Sahel as an area, if not of equal importance, of rising importance for the alliance. And the underlying assumption is whatever happens in the South will eventually find its way to the North. So this is important even for countries that have no immediate geographic proximity to the South, the Baltics, the Scandinavians, Canada. The South is important. Second question is, right, what are the problems and what can NATO do about those threats and challenges? And is right. It's not only the old problems, regional conflicts, failed states, instability, terrorism, but now you also have malign influences, and the job of those countries, and I think it's clear to all of us who's the prime suspect here, is relatively easy because all they have to do is to cause problems, destabilize countries, cause friction. They don't have to offer any answers to the problems, any solutions. So this is the situation we have to deal with in the South. And now there is also, and Mr. Loutas will talk about this, I suppose, you also have hybrid methods that are being used in the South, problems of maritime security. It's unfortunately a long list of problems. Now the question is NATO the best actor to deal with these problems? And here the answer is not straightforward. There are many things NATO can do. It cannot obviously solve all the problems. And we put a lot of emphasis in our work, in our report, on complementarity, value added, how NATO can work with other organizations and institutions, with the EU being at the top of the list. Now, of course, here we have a problem that goes back a couple of decades, EU-NATO cooperation, and we all know what the root of the problem is. And I should say here, Cyprus is making an effort to be flexible and facilitate a solution. I very much hope that the other country involved will rise to the challenge and be equally flexible so that we can get out of this impasse, because EU-NATO cooperation is central not only in the South, but across a broad range of issues and challenges. But then, of course, it's not only the EU, it's the African Union, GCC, the Arab League, and so on and so forth. So cooperation with like-minded institutions, organizations that know the region better than we do, because that's their part of the world, is very important. And then also identifying specific areas where NATO can be of use. I'm always concerned, you hear all those very ambitious suggestions about NATO doing this and that. NATO should avoid becoming a jack of all trades but master of none. There are things that NATO can do better than anyone else, but of course expanding across the board is a trap that NATO should try to avoid. So we made a number of recommendations. I can just name a few. The report will be published soon. I think it will be publicly presented in mid-May, and then it will be uploaded in NATO's site. We propose the creation of a position of a High Representative for the South to strengthen NATO's presence, closer cooperation with the African Union, establishing more regional offices, of course, not too many, because the other problem with NATO is that there is a fixed budget now, and everyone is competing for funding. So one has to try to avoid making promises on which you cannot deliver, because this is hurting the alliance credibility. And we should strengthen as much as possible NATO's contribution in areas like training, maritime security, counter-terrorism, hybrid threats. Also, climate change is an obvious topic where everyone stands to benefit if there is more cooperation, and this is something that countries in the South are willing to discuss. Two last points. We also emphasize that we have to take very seriously into account what our partners want. It's not just what we think it's a good idea to offer or do, but we have to listen to them and tell us what they need and how much cooperation they can take for political reasons. And also a number of institutional reforms inside NATO. There is a very potentially useful office or institution inside NATO, Hub for the South. Everyone keeps discussing on how this could make a greater contribution. There are various ideas. We added our own, but we think this can be a very useful tool for the alliance in gaining better situational awareness about the South. So.
Thank you for raising two topics that are very important for the next steps for NATO, but also for organizations like EU, and also for a group of countries, the global partners, with which NATO has established cooperation on strategic issues. But certainly NATO is the only organization that can provide defense and deterrence. So EU is lacking behind, despite the fact that the majority of NATO members are EU members as well. And also, as Thanos mentioned, we may need to cooperate with countries that are not NATO members or non-EU members. So we'll need to figure out how this cooperation will work. Let's start from EU, and then we go to Barbora with the global partner schemes and what we need more there. Please.
Thank you, Ino. Let me start by saying the obvious. NATO was and remains the cornerstone of collective security in Europe. And its role, it's even more pronounced after the Russian invasion in 2022. But this is the particular moment for the EU to stand on its own feet. Of course, the cooperation between the two institutions is at its best moment after 3 joint declarations, with the last being at the beginning of 2023. At this moment, there are a lot of heated discussions in the EU and bold decisions concerning the future of EU security and defense. For example, some weeks ago, a new defense industrial strategy of the EU was adopted. But in my view, it should not only be about spending or about the industrial defense technological basis. I think now is the moment to debate on and elaborate more the idea of EU strategic autonomy, that it must be a much more broader idea than just procurement, spending, and defense. We must integrate our efforts. We must create interoperable system that can be of much more use also to the allies and to our partners. And the key idea of this idea of strategic autonomy is that, apart of all the other issues, that we must be able to decide on our own, act with partners, but if needed, act also alone. And as we do not know what will happen in the US after the elections, this idea of being able to decide and act alone, if it's not possible to do it with partners, I think it becomes more and more relevant. In my view, reducing dependency will absolutely not undermine NATO. It will make it stronger, as 23 out of 27 members of the EU are partners in NATO. So today, in view of the European elections, there are many ideas on the table. For example, the idea of a new Commission on Defense, the idea of the EPP, the largest European political family, to have a budget of 0.5% of the Union's DGP, especially for defense. And of course, the idea that even the Greek Prime Minister supported of Eurobonds for defense, which is the mutualization of the sums needed for European defense. In order to wrap up, integration, of course, and I have to stress this, does not mean what we also often read in the newspapers about creating a European army. We are still very far from that. We must learn to work together, plan together, produce together, operate together, and be interoperable. Unfortunately, still, we are very far from that. But I think the key idea is how to build trust among member states in the EU. And this, and it's, sometimes it's shocking to see, trust is not always there, even if at the level of information sharing. And we have seen it in many instances in the EU. We do not have trust. When the old idea about pooling and sharing was there, I discussed with the German ambassador, and he told me, pooling is easy. We give capabilities in a common pool. But do we have the trust that when we need, we'll have the capability necessary? And this was not obvious. So I think decisions are important, measures are important, but how you build, and again, it's a French idea, but what can we do? The idea of European strategic culture, which is created around this idea of trust, remains very, very relevant. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marilena. Look, Marilena focused on what we call the Euro-Atlantic area. And certainly both organizations, the European Union and NATO, are organizations about the European continent. But Jens Stoltenberg, our former boss, spoke, I think last week on the occasion of the anniversary, about an alliance of authoritarians, mentioning Russia, China,
Iran,
North
Korea, and Iran. So this is a quite wide spectrum that NATO considers facing, observing. We don't have formal alliances with the countries of the Southeast Asia. And I doubt if the majority of the allies would approve a formal alliance with this country. But still, NATO has built in the recent years these partnerships with these countries. So where we stand and what we can envisage in the near future, given that we have the Eastern Front open.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Sina. And just a disclaimer, Jens Stoltenberg is still my boss. He might not be your boss anymore, but he's still my Secretary General.
We can speak freely now.
You can.
You can speak freely
I'm
before
the
as well,
NATO
but-
official who has to, have her lines here anyway. No, thank you very much for this question. I think it's a nice flow where we move from sort of enlargement that Oana mentioned into the south. And the NATO-EU cooperation, which I'm glad I don't have to speak about. But let's move a little bit more wider. And I think there are two important things I would like to perhaps share with the audience. And one is the idea of the partnerships that NATO has. Because very often I see or I hear or I read a bit of a confusion of what is it that NATO is actually planning to do, or what is it doing? Is it going into the Indo-Pacific? Is it expanding, or what does it mean? Why do we have Japanese foreign minister in NATO headquarters participating at a foreign ministerial meeting, for example, last week? So I'll just probably start a little bit with the idea of NATO's partnerships. And this is an idea which actually was built more than 30 years ago. The idea that NATO, after the fall of the Warsaw Pact and the Cold War was over, wanted to reach out to new friends. Whether these friends were in our neighborhood, whether they were in vulnerable neighborhood, and then eventually a little bit broader than that. So we have built a Partnership for Peace as the first program, which was very much linked to the transformational era of the 90s, where all those countries that were either they were part of the Soviet Union or the Warsaw Pact came out of this, I call it darkness. I can afford to say that because I'm a Slovak citizen, and we have been invited by our friends from Warsaw Pact in '68. So I have the full right to say this. And really to help with the transition, with the transformation of all these countries, most of whom, 2/3 of the Partnership for Peace members are in the meantime, becoming NATO members. Then there was the importance, as Thanos mentioned, and this idea is more than 20 years old, that we need to reach out to our immediate neighborhood, to the countries of North Africa and Middle East, because we share a lot of common security challenges, and unfortunately, as we continue experiencing, the threat of terrorism still remains. And as we have defined it in our strategic concept, which is our main sort of doctrinal document, if you want to call it this way, terrorism remains the second most important threat to NATO as an indirect security challenge. So then comes the question that Ino asked about, okay, so what about all the other, around the globe? Are you becoming a global alliance? What is it you want to do? We are not becoming a global alliance for various reasons, but some of them are extremely easy to understand. Firstly, if you look at our name is North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So by default, our founding treaty prevents us from going global because it's very clearly outlined in the North Atlantic Treaty, the founding document, that our area of responsibility is in the North Atlantic. And this also gives us a very clear geographical scope, and that includes also our membership. So only the European countries that are sharing our vision, they want to contribute to our common security and have the will and capabilities and commitment to do so, can enter NATO. So that part, I think, is very clear. So why are we talking with the Japanese or the Korean friends or the Australian friends? I think it's a very simple reason, because the security challenges that we face today are global. When we talk about cyber threats, when we talk about terrorism, when we talk about the rise, and my colleague will talk more about it, of emerging disruptive technologies, these are all challenges that we share. Doesn't matter where they're coming from. So this is one of the premises of why we wanted to have friends who are a little bit further away from us, geographically, maybe, but not mentally. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has provided a stronger impetus to our both political and practical cooperation and the strengthening of our relations, again, for a very simple reason. Our four partners in the Indo-Pacific, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and Republic of Korea, were on the first hours of the first days of the invasion standing by Ukraine and standing by us, in voting in the UN Security Council, in supporting Ukraine politically, financially, militarily, and you can imagine that even for a country like Japan to take several thousand Ukrainians as refugees, it's a really big deal. So these countries have stood by NATO, by Ukraine ever since, and this also shows that we share not just the same security challenges, but also the same values and interests in the international rules-based order. And the last point I will make on this, let's say, reasoning why we talk to these countries is also, and you already alluded, Ina, is that we see that what's happening on the battlefield today in Ukraine can have ramifications for the security of our partners in the Indo-Pacific, directly and indirectly. And this is what the Secretary General meant when he mentioned the cooperation between Russia and Iran and DPRK, so North Korea and China, particularly DPRK, because Russia is getting the shells and ammunition from DPRK, which they are then using directly in Ukraine, and return the North Koreans are getting Russia's advanced technology, which then the North Koreans can use to destabilize both the Korean peninsula, but also their immediate neighborhood, particularly Japan. So I think there are a lot of different reasons why we are talking and cooperating with these countries, but by no means that indicates that NATO is moving into the Indo-Pacific. It's really about cooperating with the friends, and you can never have enough friends.
Thank you, Barbora. Nikos, before the war in Ukraine, the discussion in the alliance and broader discussion was about a new warfare, a new type of warfare, which to me was quite invisible. And I think to most people, we were talking about a warfare, cyber, AI, quantum, and certainly, I mean, we should prepare for this. Then came a traditional warfare. Is this traditional warfare impedes us from developing the very important kind of warfare that is through AI, artificial intelligence, quantum, etc., where the alliance can have the advantage in regards to opponents, but opponents can also have this advantage. So please tell us what NATO is doing on this front.
Thank you for the question, and it's great for me to be in Greece. I don't have oftentimes the opportunity to speak at home, so it's a great pleasure to be here. I would start by saying there is no more traditional warfare. It's bygone. It's no longer there. We just have now a new type of warfare. We see it in Ukraine. We have been seeing it in Ukraine every single day. And the main change in the modus operandi of warfare is that you can have a $10 million military asset that can be taken out in 30 seconds by a $400 drone. You can have your energy security, your energy infrastructure, and you can have a ton of guards around it. You can even have missiles protecting it. And a hacker from their room, with maybe a $10 subscription to some sort of service, can take it down with a cyber attack. So traditional warfare no longer exists. So what can we do about it? It's a question that NATO has been thinking since 2021, and the Russian invasion in Ukraine brought a whole new impetus around it, because people actually realized that this is no longer a research question or something that a think tank would consider. Is actually something that's happening in practice. So what we've been doing since then is, first of all, laying out the strategies and clearing our thinking in a number of different areas around emerging and disrupting technologies. We started with artificial intelligence, we moved with autonomy, we're looking into quantum, we're looking into biotech and human enhancement, and more will come. What has been important in this journey for us is, first of all, not to approach those technologies in silos. Of course, all of them can be very effective, and all of them do deliver effects in the battlefield, but actually it's the combination that can bring new and more value. So actually looking at them all together is equally very important. What we have also been doing is trying to approach it from a very practical point of view. So having the strategy is great, but actually how do you implement the strategy is what's more important, and is what is going to bring you the strategic edge, the technological edge that we've been looking for. So first of all, we've been looking very closely at who are the right stakeholders and partners that we need to engage in this strategy setting process. And it's a whole new ecosystem that you need to talk to. In the past, I would say, natural interlocutor of NATO and many other defense organizations were the big defense primes, and that was great, but with all due respect, this is no longer enough today. So first we said we need to go and reach out to new communities that up until then were using, I think, the term dual use with a bit of a taboo, saying, well, dual use means the military might use it, so it's actually a bad thing. But now this has changed. So we spoke to the startup ecosystem, we spoke to the research community, we spoke to other government stakeholders, and we brought them all together in having those discussions. The second thing we did is we started identifying application areas within the alliance where emerging disruptive technologies can bring immediate short-term value while looking also at the long-term potential. Things like situational awareness or cyber defense or tackling disinformation are some of those areas. The third thing we did is we're looking very carefully now at how we can enhance the awareness of military personnel of those technologies. So practically, how can operators on the ground, use those technologies? So how can we embed those solutions in the different exercises that NATO is organizing? Otherwise, they still remain something very, very theoretical. And then the fourth thing that we did is we looked at how can we also change our way of thinking and change the way we communicate our needs and our requirements to the defense industry. So practically, this means that we engaged more with those communities. We established Diana and the NATO Innovation Fund as two initiatives that actually help us create this ecosystem of startups on both sides of the Atlantic that can then produce those solutions that we need, which we can then integrate into our defense plans and military capabilities. Of course, as you said, it's not only us getting smarter, it's also our adversaries that are getting smarter. They're also using those technologies on a daily basis. We see actually that hybrid warfare and hybrid activities are really spiking, and they did spike before the actual invasion in Ukraine. There was a spur of hybrid activity before that, but we see actually an increased, heightened level of hybrid activity. That goes anywhere from cyber attacks to phishing attacks to disinformation that is now even more fueled by new generative AI technologies. What is actually now more worrisome is that these new technologies can make those attacks more targeted, even individualized, at scale, and therefore more effective. So what can we do about it? We also observe some of our strategic competitors, like China, investing heavily in the development of those technologies, both in civilian and dual-use context. We see also foreign investment initiatives. So that's also something that keeps us on our toes to understand how we can position and how we need to position ourselves vis-a-vis that. What are we doing now from our point of view to tackle this global strategic competition? First of all, NATO and allies committed to use emerging disruptive technologies in line with international law, our norms and values, and 6 principles of responsible use. We're really committed to use those technologies in a lawful way, in a transparent way, without unintended bias, and so on and so forth. We bring together allies in order to have those discussions at NATO, as I mentioned. We do reach out to our global partners because it's not just about competition, it's also about cooperation. So we do speak, for example, with the Indo-Pacific partners about emerging and disruptive technologies. We do have a structured dialogue with the European Union on this specific topic because we need to coordinate and cooperate on that, and actually all, you're as weak as your, or the chain is as weak as its weakest link. But what I would like to say as a concluding point is that it's important, even with our strategic competitors, to focus not only on competition, but also on cooperation, especially in areas like artificial intelligence, especially in areas where it is important to have global standards and global governance for risks that can be global risks and important discussions. And therefore, many of our allies, or most of our allies, are participating in diplomatic dialogues in different fora, such as the UN or the G7, in order to help build such norms. NATO also follows discussions, for example, in the G7 with regards to disinformation. So once again, and I'll conclude with that, emerging and disruptive technologies are here. There's no more traditional warfare. It's important to stay ahead of the competition, and to be able to stay ahead of the competition, we need not only to be better, but we also need to speak to our key competitors.
Thank you very much. Our first round of interventions will by now conclude. Thank you very much for being respectful of the time schedule. But now we can open the debate for interaction between you and also with our audience. I mean, especially with our younger participants who are there exactly to converse with us. But Thanos, I think you have a remark to make first.
You asked me about NATO's perceptions from a Greek point of view. Mm-hmm. And I think it's an interesting discussion we have been having for many years. If you ask me, can NATO help Greece deal with its perceived main threat challenge? And the answer is no. But then NATO has been criticized for that, and we didn't take into account that NATO's charter was not designed to deal with problems between allies, but protecting allies from external threats. Is NATO useful for Greece? I would say definitely yes, and I would single out 4 reasons why NATO is useful. One is training and best practices. The second is defense innovation. Third is peacekeeping operations. I mean, KFOR has been instrumental in maintaining peace and stability in the Western Balkans. Of course, one can make an interesting discussion about other peacekeeping missions, ISAF, good intentions, probably poor results, but the security environment has been very different and very difficult. And the fourth one, which is not often discussed, is that NATO offers or has offered Greece unofficial channels of communication with our neighbors, Turkey, and officers that have served over the years alongside their Turkish counterparts, then rising along the ranks and becoming very senior officers in the armed forces, had the opportunity to prevent some incidents, working behind the scenes, from preventing incidents from developing into full-scale crisis. So that is NATO's rarely discussed contribution to keeping stability in this part of the world. Very quickly, 2 recommendations I forgot to mention. One is an open door policy. Accept new partners in the south. Admittedly, the list of candidates is not very long, but still, And the second, as mentioned, we have now, both in Ukraine and Gaza, not only a kinetic war, but also an information war. So we emphasized strategic communications, especially in Arabic, and then we added to NATO's traditional audience of security professionals, the youth, which we think is perhaps the best investment one can make, not only for NATO, but across the board on all kinds of initiatives.
Yes, I mean, NATO has no mechanism, I mean, to intervene between allies, but is a pillow.
I think, yeah,
strong pillow maybe, but certainly it's a pillow to absorb tensions.
I think NATO is more, actually. I think NATO is the only place where Europeans and North Americans, but also Greeks and Turks, for instance, and other allies meet every day on a whole range of issues. We've heard the whole range of issues, both diplomats and military, in the same building, in the same canteen, at the same meetings of the North Atlantic Council. We have here the former Greek ambassador to NATO, Mikhail Diamesis, who did a fantastic job, sitting at that table, and Mikhail knows, how complicated those discussions can be, but also the will to find a consensus, because of course NATO only works through consensus. And I would add a couple of other details to what Thanos very rightly said. NATO also set up a deconfliction mechanism at the height of the tensions in the Aegean, which Greece and Turkey used, and helped deconflict difficult moments. And of course, we have to welcome the new tone and the dialogue that's going on now. And another element which I think was also important was the creation of the maritime deployment in the Aegean Sea by NATO. The only place, it was only NATO that could create a platform where both Greek and Turkish military, together with ULEX could meet, Frontex could meet in order to help implement the EU-Turkey agreement on migration, and that Aegean deployment remains in place.
Thank you all. We have to stop the first part of our discussion by now. We continue with our dialogue.